Max Rupert laced his fingers behind his head and settled into his pillow to await the ghosts. He knew that Mikhail Vetrov would be lurking on the other side of sleep. It had been 3.5 years since he had shoved Mikhail through that hole in the ice, and very few nights had gone by where the memory of that killing didn't come to visit him. In dreams, Max still had the short hair and clean-shaven face of a homicide detective. But that face was long gone. Max hadn't shaved or cut his hair since the day he started his exile, so now his beard reached to his chest and his hair fell in a ponytail between his shoulder blades. Living alone in the woods, Max found that unkempt look fitting. But there were other changes that didn't sit so well with Max. His eyes seemed empty, and his cheeks had grown thin. At 45 years old, he felt too young for the tiny lines that now fanned out from his eyes and creased the edges of his mouth. And his features seemed to sag a touch, as though something inside of him, something dark and heavy, weighed him down with years that he had not yet lived. But those parts of Max that he'd hoped might change as the years went by, his heart, his conscience, clung stubbornly to the past. He had shut himself away from the world to face his reckoning, willing to accept forgiveness or retribution in equal measure. But after 3.5 years, he had found neither. His reclamation had become stagnant. But was he really isolated? Max's cabin was a small A-frame that had been in his family for more than a century. To the west lay a lake. To the south and north, Max could walk for miles and see no other human. But to the east, a thin trail snaked through the pines, connecting his cabin to the county blacktop that ran south to Grand Rapids, Minnesota, a town of about 10,000 souls. So long as he could simply drive into Grand Rapids to resupply, his exile seemed destined to fail. That failure had been on his mind on his last trip into town when he ran into Lyle Voight. What had it been? A week? 10 days? Time was unreliable at the cabin. Minutes lingered, days lasted for weeks, and months disappeared into a fog. But Lyle had helped him put his finger on the problem. Max had been cheating. He needed to live like a true hermit, with no electricity, no running water, no trips into town. Lyle's remark had been offhand, but it touched a nerve. Max had met Lyle 5 years earlier, when Lyle was sheriff of Itasca County and the first to respond to Max's 911 call the night his brother Alexander passed away at the cabin. A night Max still tried not to think about. And while they weren't close, Lyle, a quiet man in his 60s with thick hands and thin gray hair, remained the only person in Grand Rapids that Max recognized by face. On that recent trip to town, Max had just exited the Super One Foods, carrying 2 paper bags filled with soups and canned vegetables and meat, when he saw Lyle in the parking lot, sitting in the cab of his pickup truck, tapping a finger on the steering wheel to the faint sound of music. Max had never been one to talk to himself, at least not out loud, so since moving to the cabin, he had rarely said more than a few words a week, usually only a mumbled thank you in the checkout lane of the Super One. And as his beard and hair grew longer, folks seemed just fine with not talking to him. But because Lyle had parked right beside Max's SUV, Max felt obliged to at least say hello. Lyle wore a beat-up ball cap and a frayed blue jean jacket instead of his sheriff's uniform. When he saw Max, Lyle turned down his radio and leaned out the truck's window. "Hey, Max." Max opened the back of his Jeep Cherokee and put his bags inside. "Working up the gumption to go in?" Max asked, trying to sound more light-hearted than he felt. The words were like gravel in his mouth.